At my daughter's wedding, I wasn't celebrated. I was mocked, laughed at, turned into the subject of whispered jokes and cruel smirks. And what made it unbearable was that it wasn't strangers. It was my own family, the same people I had carried on my back through years of sacrifice, the ones I fed when they were hungry, the ones I clothed when they had nothing, the ones I defended when no one else would stand for them. Yet on the day I should have been honored, they decided to make me their entertainment. Every smile hid a knife. Every whisper was designed to cut. And I sat there, silent, as they enjoyed the spectacle of tearing me down. They thought they were safe in their cruelty. They thought no one else was paying attention. But what they didn't realize was that a man whose presence carried more weight than all of theirs combined was listening. And he would not stay silent for long. The hall was beautiful, chandeliers scattering light across tables draped in silver and crystal, violins drifting softly from the corner, the bride radiant in her gown, glowing with happiness. But the moment I stepped through the doors, I felt it. The air shifted, not in awe, not in pride. It shifted with disdain, heavy and sharp, directed straight at me. My steps grew heavy as I made my way to my seat. The whispers started instantly. Don't let her sit near the front. She doesn't belong with us. The words weren't hidden. They were aimed to wound. And each one struck deep. I told myself it would pass. But it didn't. It was only the beginning. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders, not for warmth, but to steady my shaking hands. I told myself to endure it. This day wasn't about me. It was about my daughter, my joy, my pride, the reason my years of hardship carried meaning. But the more I tried to ignore it, the sharper it became. One cousin leaned close to another. Her grin was cruel. Look at her dress. Secondhand again, isn't it? Another voice followed. Imagine thinking she deserves a place of honor. She should be grateful she's even invited. Their words stung like open flames. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. Not enough to drown out the music, but loud enough to pierce me. Loud enough to echo in my chest. Loud enough for nearby guests to glance at me, confused. Their eyes asked a question. Why is the bride's family mocking her mother? I sat stiff, my lips pressed tight. I told myself to breathe, to smile, to stay quiet. If silence was strength, then I would not break. But in their eyes, my silence was a weakness, and sensing it, they pushed harder. And their next words cut deeper than the first. I lowered my head. I prayed my daughter wouldn't see the pain etched across my face. But she did. From across the room, her smile faltered. Her eyes found mine, and in that instant I knew. She had heard it too. She had heard the whispers, the cruel smirks, her own relatives, her blood, mocking the woman who had raised her. She tried to catch my eye, a silent plea. Don't crumble. Don't let them win. Her lips trembled, but her eyes begged me to stay strong. I couldn't hold her gaze. I looked away, because behind my lowered eyes, tears were forming fast. Tears I refused to let her see. This was her day, her joy, her moment to shine, and I wouldn't let my sorrow infect it. I wouldn't let her happiness drown in my shame. If I had to bury my heartbreak, then so be it. I would carry the weight for both of us, just as I always had. But even as I sat there, forcing myself to smile, their laughter rose again. Louder, sharper, more deliberate. And in that moment, I realized they weren't just mocking me anymore. They were mocking her through me. Still, the insults didn't stop. Don't let her near the photographs. She's embarrassing. This is why nobody includes her. Every word was another knife in my back. They didn't whisper to hide it. They whispered to wound me. And each cut landed. The worst part? They enjoyed it. My pain was their entertainment. My humiliation was their sport. Their laughter was sharp, deliberate, and every smirk reminded me that they wanted me small, powerless, forgotten. Then came the one voice I could never ignore. My sister, the same woman who had once sat at my table, the same woman who had eaten food I worked 3 jobs to provide. She tilted her head, smirked, and spoke loud enough for the room to hear. She has always thought too highly of herself. She'll never change. Her words didn't fall flat. They were received like a gift. The guest beside her chuckled, leaned closer, and added fuel to her fire. Soon others joined in. Laughter spread like a disease across the table. My sister smiled wider, proud of the cruelty she had started. And in that moment, I realized the people I had sacrificed for were united not by love, but by tearing me apart. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have guessed, was that someone else was watching. A man sat only a few tables away, quiet, still, his eyes steady fixed on me. He didn't laugh. He didn't whisper. He didn't join in the cruelty. He simply watched. At first, I thought he was just another guest. Maybe a distant friend of the groom's family. Nothing more. But his gaze never wavered. He saw everything. Every insult. Every smirk. Every attempt to shove me aside. I didn't understand who he was. I didn't know the weight he carried with him, or how his name alone could silence the hall. His presence was heavier than all of theirs combined. But at that moment, I wasn't thinking about power. I was thinking about survival. And all I felt was the crushing weight of shame pressing down. Soon, shame would no longer be mine to carry. As the night went on, the cruelty grew impossible to ignore. A relative stood during a toast. He thanked everyone who had helped raise my daughter. Everyone except me. The omission wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A slap across the face delivered in front of strangers. Another relative leaned back and grinned. The daughter takes after her father's side. Thank God for that. The words hit like stones. The hall erupted in laughter. Their joy fed on my humiliation. I sat frozen. My chest burned with shame. My hands gripped the fabric of my dress, so tightly I thought it might tear. My breaths came shallow, sharp, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Across the room, my daughter turned again. This time her smile was gone. Her eyes held fear. She saw it. She felt it. She knew. I thought once again I would endure it in silence, because that was what I had always done. I swallowed their insults, their rejection, their indifference, year after year. I told myself silence was strength, that dignity meant keeping quiet while others tore me apart. And that night, I almost did it again. I almost let them win. I almost walked out before the dancing began, before the photographs were taken, before the final proof of my absence could be turned into another story, another weapon. She couldn't even stay the whole night, just like always. But this time, someone else had other plans. And then it happened. The scrape of a chair, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. A hand rested on my shoulder, firm but gentle, and a voice, calm yet commanding, broke through the laughter. It cut through the music, silencing every whisper in an instant. No one had any idea that at that moment, everything they thought they knew was about to change. When I was young, I learned quickly that life rarely gives kindness freely. I married early, and from the start I carried more weight than anyone should. My husband worked when he could, but often it was me who held everything together. I took in sewing. I cooked for people. I sold whatever I could to keep food on the table. Many nights, I ate nothing so my children could have something in their stomachs, and I never complained, because to me, dignity wasn't rich. It was my responsibility. It was making sure my children never saw me give up. But the same family I carried would one day pretend I had carried nothing at all. My sacrifices never bought me respect. To my siblings, I was a failure. Working with my hands was shameful. Motherhood without wealth was weakness. When they built new houses, my name was never on the guest list. When they traveled abroad, they didn't return with stories. They cut me off completely, starting new lives as though I had never existed. Months passed into years, and the only time I heard from them was when they needed something. A favor, a loan, a bed to sleep in. And when I gave it, they still found ways to sneer. In their eyes, I wasn't family. I was a reminder of what they despised. And now, at the wedding, they finally showed just how deep their contempt ran. Still, I never measured myself against them. My measure was my daughter. She was my light, my pride, the reason I endured everything without breaking. I worked until my fingers bled, so she could have shoes for school. I stayed awake through the night mending clothes, so she could look presentable at church. I fought off landlords and begged for extensions, so she could have stability. And through it all, I never regretted a single sacrifice because I believed if she had a better life than mine, then everything would be worth it. But they never forgave me for raising her stronger than they expected. My daughter grew into the kind of woman they could not control. Intelligent, ambitious, determined. She was everything they claimed to admire but secretly resented, because they saw it came from me. When she succeeded, they pretended to celebrate. Their smiles were thin. Their applause never reached their eyes, and their words cut deepest of all. She must get it from her father's side, they would say. It couldn't have come from her mother. Each time they dismissed me, I forced myself to smile, because I knew the truth. Her strength was mine. Her fire came from me, and they could not erase that, no matter how they tried. But as her wedding approached, the insults grew sharper. The slights are more deliberate. Family meals became battlegrounds. They spoke of flowers, decorations, and venues. Their voices carried across the table. And every time I spoke, silence met me. My words vanished, drowned beneath their deliberate ignoring. Then came the worst of it. My sister leaned across the table, eyes glittering, lips curled. She didn't whisper. She wanted the whole room to hear. Why don't you just let the real adults handle this? You've never organized anything in your life. The room erupted in laughter. Loud, cruel, unrestrained. My daughter's hand twitched toward mine, but I pulled it back. I wanted to remind them. I wanted to scream that I had organized my entire existence with scraps and sheer willpower, that I had built survival out of nothing. But instead, I stayed silent. In my silence, they thought they had won. At fittings and rehearsals, the in-laws sharpened their cruelty. Their words were soft, but their intent was loud. They made comments about my dress, my hair, even the way I walked into a room. One of them leaned close to another, her lips curled in a smirk. She looks like the help, not the mother of the bride. They laughed quietly, thinking their whispers were safe. But I heard every word, and I carried it like a stone in my chest. They turned their eyes to the gifts I brought. Boxes wrapped with care, chosen with love. To them, it wasn't enough. So simple, so inadequate. They didn't know. They didn't care. They couldn't imagine the nights I had gone without, the meals I had skipped, just to buy something that would honor my child. Still, that sacrifice became another weapon in their hands. But my silence persisted, and it only fed them. At the rehearsal dinner, when the photographs were being arranged, they turned to me. Maybe stand at the end, someone said. It'll balance the picture better. I knew exactly what they meant. They didn't want me near the center. They didn't want me near the joy. They didn't want me in the part of the memory that would last. So I stepped aside. I obeyed. Because I had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant shrinking myself. But inside, the wound cut deeper than I could admit. Then came the gift-giving ceremony. My turn arrived, and I placed my offering on the table. It was small, yes, but it was wrapped with care, chosen with love. Every thread of ribbon, every fold of paper carried sacrifice. But they didn't see love. They saw lack. That's all she could manage, one muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Another smirked. She could have done more if she wasn't always so unfortunate. Laughter rippled through the room. My daughter's smile faltered. She strained to hold it, but I knew she had heard. She knew. That was the moment I realized they weren't just mocking me anymore. They were mocking her through me. The week before the wedding, I found myself excluded from decisions entirely. The seating arrangements were changed without my input, the menu was finalized without my voice. And when I asked about details, they said, "Don't worry yourself, you wouldn't understand these things anyway." My own siblings, my own blood, erased me from my daughter's wedding preparations as though I were a guest instead of the mother. And when I tried to contribute, when I offered suggestions or tried to help, they laughed. She's just trying to make herself important. On the morning of the wedding, I dressed carefully. I chose the best clothes I owned, pressed them until there wasn't a wrinkle, tied my shawl neatly, and stood before the mirror telling myself, this day is hers. No matter what they say, no matter how they treat you, this day is hers. And yet, the moment I stepped into the hall, the whispers began again. One relative said, "I thought she wouldn't even show up." Brave of her to come dressed like that. Another chuckled. She must think she looks elegant. Poor thing. I understood immediately that they had come not to celebrate my daughter, but to humiliate me. They didn't realize their cruelty was being watched. They didn't know that the stranger seated a few tables away had seen the way they dismissed me at meals, the way they cut me out of the photographs, the way they mocked the very shawl on my shoulders. They thought their words were private daggers, hidden under laughter, but they were being recorded in the mind of a man who carried the power to change everything. As the night moved on, every slight, every insult, every smirk brought me closer to the moment when silence would no longer protect them. The wedding should have been the day when all wounds were set aside, the day when love triumphed over bitterness, but instead it became a stage for every insult, every cruelty my family had stored up over the years. They treated the ceremony not as a celebration of my daughter, but as an opportunity to parade their superiority, to push me further into the shadows, and to remind me in front of strangers that in their eyes I would never be enough. During the ceremony itself, I noticed how deliberately they excluded me from the most important moments. When the bridesmaids lined up for photos with my daughter, I waited quietly for my turn, but one of my nieces blocked my way with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "We've already taken the important shots." The word important sliced through me. I forced a smile, stepped aside, and watched as my daughter looked at me helplessly from the altar, unable to intervene without creating a scene on her own wedding day. It was clear they wanted me erased from her memories, as much as they wanted me erased from her life. The reception only made it worse. As the guests moved to their tables, I found my name placed far away from the center, near the edge of the hall, as though I were a distant acquaintance instead of the bride's mother. I knew immediately it was deliberate, because weeks earlier I had asked where I would be seated and had been told vaguely, "We'll handle it." And now I saw what they meant. They handled it by pushing me aside, by making sure that anyone who entered the hall would not see me sitting proudly at the front, but hidden at the margins where my presence could be ignored. The humiliation continued with every toast. My brother raised his glass and spoke of family values, of loyalty, of how much support my daughter had received from everyone sitting around him. He mentioned uncles, aunts, cousins, in-laws, neighbors, but never once did he mention me. The omission wasn't an accident. His eyes flicked toward me, daring me to react, daring me to protest so they could laugh even harder. I stayed silent, gripping the edge of my chair, but inside I felt as though I had been cut open in front of the entire hall. They were rewriting my daughter's story without me in it. Even small details became weapons. When the couple's cake was brought out, I was told to stand back because the photographs needed to look elegant. When the family gifts were presented, they placed mine at the very end, as though it were an afterthought, and someone muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "That's all she could manage." How pitiful. The words were so sharp that a few guests nearby turned in my direction, their brows furrowed, and for a moment I thought someone might defend me. But no one did. They all looked away. I wanted to vanish, but each insult chained me to the moment. At one point, my sister leaned across the table and whispered, "You should be thankful your daughter turned out well. It's in spite of you, not because of you." She smiled sweetly as she said it, then clinked her glass against her neighbor's as though she hadn't just tried to destroy me with a single sentence. I almost believed her, nearly believed that all my sacrifices had been invisible. But my daughter knew. She had seen the nights I went without food, so she could eat. She had seen me mend her shoes until they barely held together. She had seen the way I worked myself to exhaustion, so she could go to school. She knew, and when her eyes found mine again across the hall, I saw the pain in her face, the fury she was too polite to show on her wedding day. That was the only thread that held me together. And yet, my family wasn't finished. They laughed at my dress again, calling it dated and cheap. They whispered about how I hadn't contributed enough money to the wedding. They even joked about the fact that I had arrived alone, as though being a widow or being abandoned was something to sneer at. One relative said, "At least she won't dance. It would be embarrassing to watch." They laughed, and the sound of it was louder than the music in my ears. They weren't just mocking me anymore. They were trying to strip me of my dignity in front of strangers. But what they never realized was that someone else was watching closely. The man at the nearby table, the quiet guest whose suit was sharp and whose eyes never left me. While everyone else laughed, he didn't. While others joined the whispers, he remained still. He wasn't focused on the decorations, or the dancing, or the wine. He was watching me. At the time, I didn't know who he was. I didn't understand why his gaze felt so heavy. But I would soon learn that he carried more power than anyone in that hall. Still, the humiliation escalated. When the first dance began, I tried to step forward to watch, but I was blocked again. Only the important family members near the floor, someone said. The words hit like a blow, because I was the mother of the bride, and yet they had decided I wasn't important. I stood at the edge of the hall, watching my daughter dance with tears in her eyes, knowing she was as aware of their cruelty as I was. Later, during a round of photographs, the photographer asked for close family only. I stepped forward instinctively, but a cousin pulled me back by the arm and muttered, "Not you." The photographer looked confused, but when no one spoke up for me, he went along with it. I stood frozen, humiliated, as my own siblings posed proudly with my daughter while I was left in the shadows. There and then I felt erased, as though they were trying to steal not just my pride, my very place in my daughter's life. The night pressed on, and I told myself over and over to hold on, to endure, to not let them see me break. But each laugh, each smirk, each dismissal carved deeper into me. My sacrifices meant nothing to them. My dignity was a joke. My presence was an inconvenience. And though I thought I had learned to survive their cruelty in silence, that night was different. That night, someone else had seen it all, and he was waiting for the moment to act. I thought the night could not cut me any deeper, but cruelty has a way of finding new edges. My relatives had already erased me from speeches, shoved me to the edge of photographs, placed me at the margins of tables, mocked my dress, whispered about my poverty, and yet they were still hungry for more. They wanted my shame to be complete. They wanted to strip me in front of strangers until there was nothing left but silence and humiliation. My brother raised his glass and smiled as if he were a saint. His voice carried across the room as he said, "We all came together to raise this girl, didn't we? It was the whole family. Every one of us had a hand in shaping her into the woman she is today." He listed names, uncles, aunts, cousins, neighbors, one after the other, while his eyes flicked to mine with each omission. He wanted me to feel every absence, every skipped beat, every calculated erasure. Guests applauded politely, clinking glasses, but I saw the confusion in their eyes. They wondered why the mother of the bride had not been mentioned once. My brother lifted his glass higher and smirked at me before drinking. He thought he had won, but what he didn't know was that someone else was watching every move. My brother's hand trembled. The glass he held slipped and shattered on the floor. Gas spread through the hall. He bent to pick it up, fumbling, but no one moved to help him. The cracks in their armor were beginning to show. Then the billionaire's eyes moved to my sister, who had sneered all evening, whispering about how I should be grateful just to exist in the room. "And you," he said, "you mocked her dress, her presence, her very existence, as though clothing defines worth. Tell me, what have you sacrificed? What have you built? This woman you mock is the reason there is a bride to celebrate today. Without her, there would be no wedding, no family, no daughter standing here. And yet you laughed at her as if she were nothing. What kind of sister does that? What kind of human being?" My sister's smile broke. She looked away, cheeks flushing, unable to meet his eyes. One by one, their smugness was collapsing. The in-laws who had called me for help, who had laughed at the thought of me near the photographs, shifted uneasily as his gaze settled on them. "And you," he said, "the ones who claim to be family by marriage, you called her unworthy. You mocked her place. Do you not understand that the dignity of labor, the power of survival, is greater than all your arrogance combined? Without her sacrifices, you would not be sitting at this table. Without her love, there would be no bride for your son to marry. You dressed yourselves in wealth tonight, but she is dressed in something you will never own: honor." The in-laws shrank in their seats, the wine in their glasses suddenly bitter. Every table felt the weight of his words. Then he turned back to me. His eyes softened, but his voice carried further. You may not remember me, he said, but I remember you. When I was a boy, my family had nothing. We were hungry, desperate, and forgotten. And when others turned us away, you opened your door. You gave us food when we had none. You sewed clothes for us when we couldn't afford a single thread. You gave us dignity when the world treated us like dust. I never forgot. Every success I built, every step I climbed, I carried the memory of you with me. And I swore that one day I would honor the woman who gave without asking for anything in return. That day is today. The hall gasped. Whispers rippled like fire across the room. Strangers turned to stare at me, eyes wide with shock, as though they were seeing me for the first time. My relatives' faces fell, drained of color, their mouths open but no words escaping. He dropped the revelation that no one expected. He raised his glass. Tonight, I honor my debt. To the bride, I give a trust fund large enough to secure her future, a foundation she can build on without fear. She will never need to beg from the very people who have spent their lives mocking her mother. To her, I give her the freedom her mother fought to give her. My daughter's hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. She rushed across the hall and threw her arms around me, crying into my shoulder, "Mama, they'll never hurt us again." The billionaire wasn't finished. And to her mother, he continued, his voice growing stronger, I give the deed to a home of her own, a house she will own outright, a place where no one can ever belittle her again, where she can live in peace and dignity. And beyond that, I pledge a share in one of my businesses so that the same woman who once fed me when she had little will never again know the taste of hunger or humiliation. The hall exploded in gasps. Chairs scraped. Guests covered their mouths. Some clapped, some shook their heads in disbelief, and others wept openly at the sheer gravity of the moment. My relatives sat in silence, their pride stripped bare. My brother's face was white, my sister's lips trembled, my cousins hid their faces in their hands. The in-laws, once so arrogant, bowed their heads low, staring into their glasses as though they could sink into them and disappear. The gifts were not just wealth, they were judgment, and the judgment was final. The billionaire's voice carried one final blow. You spent the night mocking her. You should have spent the night honoring her. You treated her like nothing. But I tell you now, she is everything. She is the foundation of this family. Without her, there is nothing to celebrate tonight. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, applause broke out, not from my family, but from strangers, from guests who had seen the cruelty unfold and now saw the truth laid bare. The applause spread, filling the hall, drowning out the shame that clung to my relatives like a shroud. My daughter squeezed my hand, her tears falling freely, her pride shining brighter than any jewel. My relatives scrambled. My brother stammered, "We didn't mean," my sister whispered. "We were only joking," my cousin muttered. We didn't realize, but their words fell flat, ignored by the crowd. No one wanted their excuses. No one believed them. The power they had wielded with cruelty was gone, stripped away in a single evening, their mask shattered. They realized too late that the hall no longer belonged to them. And I, who had been silent all night, who had endured years of insults, who had carried my family on my back while they spat in my face, finally understood the truth. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight. The truth had spoken louder than I ever could. My dignity, my silence, my sacrifices had been vindicated, not by my voice, but by the voice of a man who had once been a hungry child I had helped. He leaned down and whispered, just for me, dignity always wins. And as I sat there, trembling not with shame, but with release, I realized the night was no longer theirs. It was mine. The applause faded into murmurs, but the silence that replaced it was not empty. It was heavy, thick with recognition. The same hall that had echoed with cruel laughter earlier in the night now carried a different sound, respect. I looked at their faces and saw the shift. Strangers who had once believed my family's lies now saw me clearly, and in their eyes I was no longer invisible. I was no longer the joke. I was the mother, the foundation, the reason this day existed. My daughter clung to my arm, her tears falling freely, her smile unrestrained. "Mama," she whispered, loud enough for those nearest to hear, "you are my everything. You always have been. Her words struck deeper than any insult my family had ever thrown. Because in that moment I understood everything I had endured, every sacrifice, every silent night of pain, every insult swallowed without reply, had led here. And it was worth it. They thought I had nothing, but dignity, love, and truth were always mine. One by one, my relatives began to stir, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of hundreds of eyes. The ones who had mocked me most viciously, the ones who had taken pride in pushing me down, could no longer hold their heads up. My brother bent to pick up the shards of his broken glass, muttering under his breath, "We didn't mean it like that," but even he didn't believe his own words. My sister tried to whisper to the cousin beside her, but the cousin turned away, unwilling to be associated with her shame. My in-laws stared at the tablecloth as though it could swallow them whole. And then, without a word, they started to leave. No grand excuses, no dramatic farewells. They slipped out quietly, one after another, their heads lowered, their arrogance dissolved. The same people who had filled the night with laughter at my expense now walked out in silence, dragging their shame behind them. Guests turned to watch them go, some shaking their heads, some sneering openly at them. Their power, their false superiority, had been broken in full view of everyone. The ones who mocked me could not bear to stay in the light of truth. I did not follow them. I did not rise to hurl words at their retreating backs. I sat still, taller than I had felt in years, and let their shame cling to them. Because revenge wasn't mine to take. The truth had already done the work. They had been undone by their own cruelty. Guests began to approach me, not to pity me, but to honor me. A woman I had never met touched my hand and said, "I wish I had half your strength." A man bowed his head and said, "You raised her well. You are the reason we are celebrating tonight." Another whispered, "We saw what they did. We will never forget what we saw tonight." Their words filled the cracks in my spirit, not because I needed their validation, but because it proved that the lies my family told for years could no longer stand. My daughter pressed her forehead to mine and said through her tears, "Mama, I am proud of you. I will always be proud of you." And in that embrace, I felt everything I had carried, all the years of humiliation, all the wounds of silence, lifted from me. She was my pride, my victory, my living proof that my sacrifices had never been wasted. The billionaire watched quietly, his job done, his words still echoing across the hall. He didn't need to speak again. His presence alone was enough. When our eyes met, I nodded. He smiled faintly, and that was all. Because he hadn't changed me. He hadn't given me dignity. He had only revealed what had always been true. That my worth could not be erased, that my sacrifices could not be mocked away, that my dignity was greater than their cruelty. The billionaire didn't change me. He only revealed what was always true, that respect cannot be bought, and cruelty always collapses in the end. My relatives were gone now, their absence louder than their insults had been. The hall belonged to me, to my daughter, to the truth. The applause rose again, stronger this time, not for speeches or wealth, but for survival, for endurance, for love that had outlasted cruelty. And as the sound filled my chest, I realized the greatest justice was not wealth or gifts or public praise. The greatest justice was that they could never erase me again. But even as I sat there, filled with release, I knew one thing. My family's cruelty would not end simply because they had been humiliated once. People like them do not disappear. They retreat. They regroup. They whisper in shadows, waiting for another chance to strike.